The Second World War in the Pacific was a war of distance, steel, and air. By 1944, the United States Navy had turned the tide. The great carrier battles of the Philippine Sea had shredded Japanese naval air power. The mighty battleships of the Imperial Navy were either sunk or trapped in harbors. Japan's empire, which had once stretched across the Pacific like a great shadow, was shrinking back toward its home islands. But it was precisely when Japan seemed cornered that it reached for a new, terrible weapon. Not one forged of technology or steel, but one built on flesh and blood. This weapon was the kamikaze, the birth of the special attack. The word kamikaze, literally divine wind, harkened back to the 13th century, when two great typhoons had scattered Mongol fleets threatening Japan. For centuries, the story was told as proof that the gods themselves protected the Japanese islands. Now, in 1944, Japan's military invoked the same imagery. This time, though there would be no typhoon, the divine wind would be young men, strapping themselves into cockpits and turning their planes into flying bombs. The Japanese called them tokubitsu, kogeki-tai, the special attack units. To Western ears, it was soon shortened to kamikaze. The idea was simple but chilling. Planes packed with fuel and explosives would dive deliberately into American warships, using the pilot's life as the final guidance system. In theory, this would allow an old, slow plane to inflict as much or more damage than a state-of-the-art bomber. And in practice, it worked far too well. The first shocks, the first organized kamikaze attacks, came during the Battle of Laffey Gulf in October 1944. American sailors watched at first in disbelief as Japanese planes refused to pull away after releasing bombs. Instead, they came hurtling down in fire and smoke, smashing into decks and superstructures. The carrier USS St. Louis became the first major victim, sinking under kamikaze strikes on October 25. Nearly 150 sailors were killed. Survivors described the horror, the plane diving straight into the flight deck, the explosion tearing through the hangars, fires racing out of control. The ship went under in minutes. Word spread quickly through the fleet. These weren't just desperate individual gestures. This was a new tactic, a new kind of war. Admiral William Halsey called it the most desperate and the most effective weapon the Japanese had devised. The American shock for U.S. sailors. The shock was profound. In normal battle, even the most determined enemy pilot tried to survive. There was always a chance they might turn away, break off, retreat. But now, every speck on the horizon might be a suicide plane. Every attacking pilot was committed to death. The gunners on American ships fired until their barrels smoked red-hot. But even when riddled with bullets, kamikaze pilots often pressed on, guiding their wounded aircraft into the side of a destroyer or down onto a carrier's flight deck. The impact was more than physical. It was psychological. You couldn't stop them, remembered one sailor. They didn't care about dying, and we cared very much about living. The tactic horrified American commanders and stunned the public back home. Newspapers described them as suicide squadrons. To a Western mindset, the deliberate sacrifice of life in this way was almost unthinkable. But in Japan, it was being celebrated as the ultimate act of patriotism. The spirit of sacrifice. By early 1945, kamikaze units were being formed in greater numbers. Their pilots were often very young, many in their late teens or early 20s. Some had only a few dozen hours of flight training. Some had barely learned to land, but landing was no longer required. Before their final missions, they were given ceremonial send-offs. They drank a last cup of sake. Some received headbands with the rising sun, the hachimaki, a symbol of resolve. They often wrote farewell letters to parents or lovers, and then they climbed into planes packed with fuel, knowing they would never return. Many believed they were dying to protect their homeland, their families, their emperor. Others were swept along by a culture that glorified sacrifice and punished hesitation. Some went willingly, others with quiet dread. But once they were airborne, there was no turning back. The road to Okinawa. By the beginning of 1945, the U.S. military was closing in on the Japanese home islands. The Philippines had fallen. Iwo Jima was invaded in February and, at staggering cost, taken in March. The next step would be Okinawa, a large island just 350 miles from Kyushu, Japan's southernmost main island. Japanese commanders knew Okinawa was the last defensive barrier before the homeland itself. and they prepared to unleash their kamikaze forces on a scale the Americans had never seen. What the U.S. Navy experienced there would be unlike anything before in modern warfare. The invasion of Okinawa began on April 1, 1945, Easter Sunday. More than 1,300 American ships were gathered offshore, carrying 180,000 troops. It was the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War. The Japanese had very few ships left, and their air force was greatly diminished, but they had saved their trump card, the Kamikaze, Operation Kikasugi. In April and May, the Japanese launched a series of massive kamikaze waves, called Operation Kikasugi, meaning floating chrysanthemum. The chrysanthemum symbol of the emperor now became a symbol of death in the skies. Over the course of 10 coordinated attacks, nearly 1,500 kamikaze sorties were launched against the U.S. fleet at Okinawa. The results were catastrophic. On April 6, the first great wave struck. Hundreds of planes roared out of Kyushu, flying low over the water to evade radar. American ships scrambled, guns blazing. Some planes were shot down in fireballs, but others broke through. The destroyer USS Bush was hit 3 times and sank with 94 men aboard. The USS Colquhoun went down the same day, taking 34 sailors with her. Dozens of other ships were struck, some limping back with decks aflame, others vanishing beneath the sea. And this was just the beginning. USS Bunker Hill, perhaps the most infamous kamikaze strike, came on May 11, 1945. The aircraft carrier USS Bunker Hill, a proud veteran of Pacific battles, was sitting off Okinawa when 2 kamikazes dived out of the clouds in rapid succession. The first plane slammed into the flight deck, its bomb igniting parked aircraft and fuel lines. Seconds later, the second kamikaze struck. Explosions tore through the hangars. Fire engulfed the ship. Nearly 400 sailors were killed and more than 250 wounded. Survivors described the inferno as unimaginable. Men trapped below decks, the steel itself glowing from heat, planes cooking off their own ammunition. The Bunker Hill was nearly lost. Only heroic firefighting kept her afloat. The image of that burning carrier became etched into the memories of every sailor in the Pacific. The human side. For the Japanese pilots, Okinawa was both duty and death sentence. Many were university students who had been drafted into aviation programs. They were given only basic flight training before being assigned to suicide units. Some believed fervently in their mission. Letters recovered after the war spoke of dying with honor and becoming a shield for the nation. One young pilot wrote to his mother, "When you hear the sound of the wind, think of it as me, returning home to you." Others were less certain. Diaries revealed quiet despair, fear, even resentment. But there was no choice. Refusal meant shame, or worse, imprisonment. The toll on the U.S. Navy. The U.S. Navy paid heavily. In the Battle of Okinawa alone, 36 ships were sunk and 368 damaged, mostly by kamikazes. Nearly 5,000 American sailors were killed, more than in any other single battle at sea in U.S. history. The constant threat wore men down. Radar operators and lookouts scanned the skies endlessly. Their nerves stretched to breaking. Any speck might be death. Gunners fired until their arms ached. Sailors slept in life jackets, expecting at any moment to be blown into the sea. The kamikaze campaign turned Okinawa into not just a battle, but a nightmare. America stunned back home. Reports of the suicide planes shocked the American public. Newspapers carried stories of death pilots and human bombs. For many, it seemed like proof that Japan would never surrender, that they would fight to the last breath. And that realization cast a dark shadow on the future. For if this was what Japan would do for Okinawa, what would they unleash when the Allies invaded the home islands themselves? That question leads us into the final chapter. By the summer of 1945, Okinawa was secured, at a staggering cost. The U.S. military now looked toward the ultimate goal, the invasion of Japan itself. The plan was called Operation Downfall. It would have been the largest amphibious invasion in history, and at its center loomed the nightmare of the kamikaze. The planned defense, unbeknownst to the Allies, Japan had been preparing for this moment. They had hoarded more than 10,000 aircraft for the defense of the home islands. Many were outdated. Some were training planes, but all could be turned into kamikazes. The plan, called Operation Ketsugo, envisioned wave after wave of suicide attacks. Not hundreds, but thousands. Every airfield, every hidden runway, every stretch of flat road would launch planes. The skies over Japan would become a storm of death. The Huma Reservoir, the pilots were already being trained. Thousands of young men and some teenagers were drilled in the basics of flight. They wrote farewell letters. They posed for photographs with cherry blossoms, symbols of beauty that falls at its peak. One pilot, just 17 years old, wrote, "I do not fear death, only that I may not strike true." Another confessed in his diary, "I want to live, but if I refuse, I shame my family, so I will fly." The tragedy of the kamikaze was that behind each flaming dive was a human being, a son, a brother, a student who might have lived a full life. Instead, they were sacrificed to a strategy born of desperation. The American fearless planners feared the worst. If Okinawa cost nearly 5,000 naval dead, how many would the invasion of Japan claim? The estimates ranged from hundreds of thousands to more than 1 million American casualties. The Navy dreaded the thought of facing kamikaze waves of unprecedented scale. Officers openly admitted they had no perfect defense. "We can stop many," one admiral said, "but not all. Some will always get through." It was a nightmare scenario, the atomic decision. But history turned in another direction. In August 1945, the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The devastation was unprecedented. The Japanese government, seeing no hope, finally surrendered. Operation Downfall was never launched. The massive kamikaze storm that was waiting to erupt never came. The thousands of young pilots who had written farewell letters never took off. The war ended in fire, but not the fire they had expected. The legacy, for the Americans who had lived through Okinawa, the memory of the kamikaze was seared into their minds. They remembered the sight of planes diving straight into their ships, the explosions, the screams, the fires. They remembered the feeling of helplessness, fighting an enemy who did not fear death. For Japan, the kamikaze became both a symbol of sacrifice and of tragedy. Today, they are remembered not as heroes or villains, but as young men caught in the gears of history, victims of a nation's desperation. Closing America was stunned in 1945, not only by the destruction of the kamikazes, but by what they revealed. That war, when pushed to its extremes, could strip away even the instinct for survival. The kamikaze strikes never truly stopped in 1945. Their memory lingers still, a chilling reminder of what happens when human life is spent as a weapon. The divine wind once saved Japan from invasion. In 1945 it blew again, but this time it carried only fire and loss.